Hi, Professor Gardiner here. I was asked to create a short primer on policing to help students better understand some of the issues, the pertinent research, and the potential next steps. I'm going to keep this as short, as simple as I can, but I'll be honest, there are a lot of layers to this current crisis and much to process and understand about policing. Here we go. What purpose do police serve? Why do we need police, and what do we expect them to do? Which societal problems do we expect them to address, to respond to, and to solve? These are important questions and ones that are being asked currently, as many call for police departments across the country to be dismantled, defunded, and reinvented. First, it's important to understand that in the United States, we have two systems of social control. Informal social control, which is we the people, as in our parents, neighbors, teachers, coaches, clergy, colleagues, and others, are considered informal social control. People in our immediate vicinity or network encourage our adherence to norms and laws. That's what informal social control is. While this is generally effective, it's not always effective, and that's why we need a formal mechanism for social control. This is our police. So American police exist to protect life, liberty, and property. They exist to protect the rights granted to each and every one of us in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And it's important to think of officers in this regard as opposed to simply enforcing laws or maintaining order, because this reminds us of their ultimate purpose in the United States as guardians of democracy. Key to this discussion is that police officers are agents of the government, and they are representatives of the government. This means they derive their authority from the people, and they are accountable to the people. Sir Robert Peel, founder of the London Metropolitan Police, said it best when he said, "Police at all times should maintain a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that police are the public and the public are the police. The police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interest of community welfare and existence." In other words, they get paid to help society, or us, enforce social norms and laws when our informal social control efforts are insufficient. Police are generally considered to be the most visible agents of government. This is why legitimacy is crucial, not just for our public safety, but for our democracy. Police derive their authority from us, the people, which means that they are accountable to us, the people. Without our authority, they cannot do the job we've entrusted them to do. Legitimacy is what separates democratic policing from non-democratic policing. This is because police are one of the only groups of people, military being another, that are given the right to use coercive force against other groups of people. Therefore, police must be viewed as legitimate if they're going to be effectual. Members of society must agree that police use of coercive force is morally appropriate and valid, in other words, legitimate. The current protests make it very clear that the public is challenging police legitimacy and moral authority. The core tenets of democratic policing, as you see on your screen, are fundamental fairness, which is treating everyone the same, regardless of age, gender, race, or ethnicity, sexual orientation, or any other characteristic. Transparency is being open and honest with the public. Accountability is receiving feedback, acknowledging alleged wrongs, investigating complaints, and making any necessary corrections or amends. We'll talk more about that in a minute. When individuals believe that an institution is appropriate, proper, and just, they are more likely to comply with the rules and to defer to the institution's authority. So legitimacy of the institution is very important, and it is highly dependent on police behavior, both actual and perceived. Police legitimacy, then, can be thought of as the extent to which we recognize and are willing to defer to the authority of the police to regulate our behavior, including obeying laws. We can think of police legitimacy as falling along a continuum ranging from strong to weak, with the position along the continuum being determined by police behavior and, importantly, the public's perception of police behavior. Researchers have explored many different factors that might improve police legitimacy and have generally focused their efforts on the idea of procedural justice. meaning how police treat members of the public can impact their views on individual officers, as well as the department and the profession as a whole. There are 4 key aspects or pillars of procedural justice. Citizen participation, in other words, citizens feel that they've had a voice in the matter and that they've been able to explain their side of things prior to the officer making a decision about what to do. Perceived neutrality on the part of the police in making the decision. Police treating all parties with dignity and respect during the interaction, and whether or not the police convey trustworthy motives. If they do these things, we should see improved citizen satisfaction with the police, willingness to cooperate with the police, trust in the police, and confidence in the police. These things are all really important, and they're tied together because individuals who do not trust the police don't call the police to report crime, and they do not cooperate with police later on, meaning they don't provide witness statements or call into anonymous tip lines, etc. We know through research that police rarely solve crimes on their own. They solve crimes when the public provides straightforward and consistent information that leads to suspect identification and eventually arrest. Communities that don't trust the police can experience higher levels of crime because area criminals are not reported, arrested, or held accountable for their crimes, which means crime flourishes in these communities. A way to reduce crime is to build trust and relationships through community policing. This figure shows how the use of different policing strategies can perpetuate a cycle of crime in neighborhoods or neutralize it. Policing strategies that are implemented in a race-neutral way improve legitimacy and cooperation. Meanwhile, policing strategies that are implemented in non-race-neutral ways hurt police community relations, which in turn hinders police officers' ability to deter and solve crime. Non-race neutral policing strategies, which reduce legitimacy, can also negatively impact officer safety, since the community is at odds with the police instead of in partnership with the police. As you can imagine, legitimacy is very fragile. Once officers in a department break the public trust, it's really difficult to get it back. As a result of former Minneapolis Officer Derek Chauvin's actions, police across the nation will spend years trying to rebuild their legitimacy with their individual communities. The central issue at this moment is that police as a collective, not individually, but as a collective, are not performing their job duties in a fundamentally fair manner. Some people say that this is a real problem, while others argue it's only a perception problem. I would tell the people who believe that it's a perception problem 2 things. 1, that's incorrect. It's a real problem in many places. And 2, it doesn't even really matter. Regardless of whether you have a real problem or a perceived problem, you have a problem, and that problem needs to be addressed. As I've mentioned, police behavior has direct consequences for public perceptions of the police and subsequent trust and confidence in the police. But there can also be a disconnect between the perception and the reality of police, which can be highly problematic. So one way to think about democratic policing is that the principal concern of democratic policing is not the behavior of citizens, but the behavior of officers. As you can see, though, it's not just the behavior of the police, but it's also the public perception of police behavior that matters in police community relations, public support, and police legitimacy. Sometimes there's disagreement over whether an officer's behavior was appropriate or not, and reasonable people can and do disagree. But it's important to emphasize that police officers have a spotlight on them at all times, and they have a duty to be accountable to the public for their behavior while in uniform, and some would also say while out of uniform as well. Bias policing, whether actual or perceived, is a huge threat to police legitimacy. Whereas we used to talk about racial profiling, we now speak of police profiling in more general terms, knowing that it isn't limited to race. Much of the current research focus on bias policing actually shifted towards helping officers gain self-awareness of implicit bias, or what we would call unconscious bias, and the potential impacts as well as strategies for managing and minimizing these potential impacts in their work. If you haven't taken an implicit bias test or an implicit association test before, I urge you to Google that and take one of those. It's important to know that implicit bias is not a dirty word. It's something that we all have, and it's a part of our survival instincts. We all need to decide fairly quickly whether an approaching stranger is friend or foe, whether the person intends us harm or not. In fact, you can probably spot a salesperson halfway down the mall, and you probably behave differently towards that salesperson than if you thought the person was going to ask you for directions or something like that. We need to recognize our implicit biases so that we can understand how they affect us. Officers who have been trained to recognize their own implicit biases can take an extra half second to decide whether the person in front of them truly poses a potentially deadly threat, or if their implicit bias is causing them to perceive a suspect as more dangerous or less dangerous because of how the person looks: race, sex, age, height, weight, tattoos, etc. Central to the current protest is the question of police use of force, and in particular, deadly force. Let's tackle the deadly force question first. At present, we simply do not know how often or to what extent the police in the United States use force upon its citizens in any given year. We are getting closer to knowing how often the police use lethal force. Except for a few agencies and states which were tracking their own use of force incidents, no one was really tracking use of force nationally till about 2015 or 2016. It wasn't until the focus on police shootings in 2014, 2015 that the public started doing what the federal government should have been doing for years. The Washington Post created a database of fatal police shootings in 2016 by searching local news reports across the country, as well as law enforcement websites and social media and other independent databases. In addition to the Washington Post, mappingpoliceviolence.org is another comprehensive database used by academics. These tell us that between 1,000 and 1,100 people lose their lives to police killings every year. These civilian efforts have actually pushed law enforcement to finally establish their own national database to track use of force incidents. Just like crime data and information on officers shot and killed, use of force data will be collected by the FBI from local agencies. Although this is a voluntary reporting system, the hope is that most agencies will contribute to it, just like they do the Uniform Crime Report and NIBRS. This national database began collecting data in January 2019, but it'll be at least another year before we have any solid data from it. In August 2019, California passed AB 392, and it became the first state in the nation to restrict officer use of lethal force to only when necessary instead of when reasonable. Now, use of lethal force by police must be reasonable to meet the U.S. Supreme Court standard, and it must be necessary to meet state law. When deciding whether lethal force was necessary, reviewers will now look at all of the actions leading up to the use of force, including the officer's actions. This is new for California, and in fact, other states and the federal government are now looking at California's law and considering implementing it or similar legislation in the wake of George Floyd's death. That brings us to the question, how often do police in America use excessive force? The answer is we have absolutely no idea. Why? Because there's no objective, measurable definition of excessive force. The 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act does require the collection of excessive use of force data, but honestly, no attorney general has actually required compliance with the law, nor created the infrastructure to actually accomplish it. So the new National Use of Force data collection will finally provide information on use of force incidents by police and characteristics of these fatal encounters, but it will not judge whether a use of force incident was excessive. So having said that, all agencies investigate use of force incidents within their own department. And if an officer's use of force is deemed to be outside policy, that officer will receive some sort of consequence, at least theoretically. This should be recorded in a department use of force report, which may or may not be available to the public. The most transparent departments put this information on their website, though it isn't always easy to find. As far as general use of force goes, the Police Public Contact Survey, which is an extension of the National Crime Victimization Survey, gives us some information about this. It tells us that use of force is rare. In fact, approximately 1 in 5, or about 20% of survey respondents, had contact with the police. Of those, only 1.6% reported that officers used or threatened to use force during the encounter. About 3/4 of those who did experience the threat or use of force, so about 530,000 people, reported that they thought it was excessive. And 87% of those folks believed that the police acted improperly. The most common use of force is actually physical force. It's not lethal force, and it's not conducted energy devices, and it's not chemical weapons. It's straight physical force, meaning the officer pushed, shoved, or grabbed the suspect. It is uncommon for a suspect to be injured as a result of the use of force. Males, blacks, and youths are more likely to experience the use of force, as are individuals who are under the influence, those who resist arrest, and those experiencing a severe mental illness episode. So it is important to note that physical force can vary quite dramatically in its effect, right? Getting pushed to the ground or shoved, that's very minor in comparison to what George Floyd went through, what Eric Garner went through, which are both also physical force instances of use of force. So while the police public contact survey indicates that 98.4% of all encounters do not involve any force or even the threat of force, scholars believe that this actually underestimates police use of force because it excludes recently incarcerated individuals from the survey who could have been in jail during the survey period, and arrestees are thought to be at a higher risk for having force used upon them. A recent survey of inmates confirmed that this was the case, and they found that the inmate sample was more likely to experience force at a higher level than the general population, and they were more likely to report injury from force. Importantly, though, we do not know if or how suspect behavior such as resisting arrest or being under the influence played a role into the higher rates of use of force against this population. But of course, this is the exact issue that people are protesting in the street. So we don't want to make any conclusions one way or the other, and we don't want to insinuate that the suspect's actions dictated an excessive response from police. Suspects' actions should dictate an appropriate and measured response from police, not an excessive response. And the response should be commensurate with the crime that was committed or suspected to have been committed. Accountability to the public is a key component of democratic policing. Being accountable requires a few different things. First, there must be a formal mechanism for the police department to receive feedback directly from the public. And it's important that it be tracked through ultimate resolution. So what happened? The chief executive of a law enforcement agency typically reports to an elected official, such as a mayor in the case of a city police chief, or an elected body, such as a city council or a county board of supervisors, and may themselves be an elected official, common among county sheriffs. In this sense, they are in theory, if not practice, politically responsive to the electorate. Second, when appraised of a problem, the police must clearly acknowledge the behaviors that are being viewed as a violation of public trust. The police do not necessarily need to agree that the behaviors violate trust at this point, but they need to at least acknowledge that the public has alleged something to have happened that shouldn't have happened. It may be a perceptual issue, but the use of force or a misunderstanding concerning police procedure or whatever the case may be, it doesn't actually really matter. What's required is some formal acknowledgement by the agency that the public has identified a particular behavior as problematic. Third, the police must then investigate, explain, and correct, if necessary, the identified problem in a timely fashion. These three components are necessary requirements to conclude that an accountability structure exists in a police agency and for the police to be accountable to the public for the behavior of their officers. Extending this a bit, accountability structures can be internal to an organization as well as external to an organization. So internal accountability structures are commonly found in the form of a citizen complaint process, an internal affairs function, something similar, and a disciplinary process. With regard to external accountability structures, we're primarily referring to citizen oversight of the police. However, we're not going to get into those specifics here. So before we talk about the problems with accountability, it's important for us to take a step back to get a picture of what we expect of police and what draws individuals to want to work as police officers. August Vollmer, as you can see, is the chief of Berkeley Police Department in the early 1900s. He was a major proponent of professionalizing policing at a time when most police were corrupt and incompetent. He wanted to elevate the job to a profession. Here, he is laying out the ideal traits of a police officer. He chose his allusions carefully, and these historical characters would have been widely known and recognized at the time of his writing. He says, law enforcement officers should have the wisdom of Solomon, the courage of David, the patience of Job, and the leadership of Moses, the kindness of the Good Samaritan, and the diplomacy of Lincoln, the tolerance of the carpenter of Nazareth, and finally an intimate knowledge of every branch of the natural, biological, and social sciences. This is quite a list. Vollmer is clearly painting a picture of a saintly and knowledgeable police officer. This was his hope and expectation, and to be honest, this continues to be our expectation today. A little bit unrealistic in some senses. So if you ask somebody why they want to be a police officer, most aspiring officers will tell you they want to help people and they want to serve their community. They want to give back. Of course, some, probably most, are also drawn to the high adrenaline version of policing sold by Hollywood, as well as department recruiting videos. Given the unique and complex nature of the job, along with the important powers officers are given, it's vitally important that we recruit the right individuals to be police officers and that we weed out those not morally up to the job. For this reason, police officers undergo a more thorough vetting process than almost any other job that exists, which makes sense given their powers and symbolism. Requirements, testing, and screening processes vary by agency, and all states have standards that agencies must use as a minimum threshold. Most agencies, however, have a very thorough and extensive vetting process, especially those in California. We have some of the highest training standards in the country. Yet there are more than 18,000 police agencies across the country, all of which have unique hiring situations and needs. For example, small departments often do not have the budget to hire college graduates or other well-qualified applicants. These poorly resourced agencies risk hiring individuals who are not qualified to be trusted with coercive powers and deadly weapons. They also often don't have training budgets as well. This chart gives you some perspective. It shows the percentage of college-educated officers by census region. On average, 30% of officers across the country have a bachelor's degree or higher. Agencies in the Northeast and Pacific regions have the highest proportions of college-educated officers, while agencies in the South have the lowest proportion. California is included in the Pacific region. As you can see, Orange County, represented by the orange bar, and Los Angeles County are quite a bit above average. This is good news for Southern California because although the value of a bachelor's degree for police officers is not indisputable, more research indicates positive effects than research indicates no correlation or negative consequences. So even though college-educated officers typically receive higher salaries, research suggests that officers with a bachelor's degree or higher save departments money. This is because research has found that college-educated officers have fewer individual liability cases filed against them. In other words, they don't get sued for misconduct. They also are generally thought to be better report writers, more innovative, and more likely to take on leadership roles within the department than officers without a college degree. If degree-holding officers are truly better report writers, that could translate into better investigations, higher court case filings, fewer evidentiary constitutional challenges, fewer false confessions or wrongful convictions, and/or more successful prosecutions. It's also been found that college-educated officers are less resistant to change and more likely to embrace new methods of policing. They also tend to have fewer citizen complaints filed against them, fewer disciplinary actions taken against them than officers without a degree. These last benefits may be particularly valuable for agencies which serve majority minority communities where police public relations are often strained. Despite most agencies' best efforts to weed out individuals who should not be entrusted with coercive powers by the public, some individuals make it through the application process and the hiring process. And some officers start out as model officers but change over time or simply make a horrible decision on a single occasion. These officers need to be held accountable for the behavior, but that is often difficult to do because there are mechanisms in place to protect officers. Listed on the screen are a few of these things that can make holding officers accountable difficult. These protections exist because police officers have the right to, and sometimes the need to, use coercive force to carry out their duties, and they often need to make split-second decisions in rapidly evolving situations based on limited information. They need to have some protections against individual liability for times when the officer's action, though reasonable and within policy, resulted in an unfortunate outcome. Without these individual protections, no one would be willing to do the job of police officer. However, when these protections are too broad, they fail to hold officers accountable by protecting officers whose behavior was egregious and wrong. Officers may commit misconduct that leads to their termination or dismissal from their department. However, dismissal isn't always the final word on the matter. Officers may be rehired by another jurisdiction, in which case the new jurisdiction just inherited the old jurisdiction's problem. This can be a conscious decision by the hiring agency, especially in small jurisdictions where financial resources are limited and lateral officers are simply scarce. Fortunately, most states have the authority to revoke a peace officer's certification. This is often referred to as decertification, essentially invalidating their training credentials and making them unemployable as a law enforcement officer. The reasons for decertification vary, but in all such cases, a state authority determines that the subject officers should not be allowed to continue exercising the duties and privileges of a law enforcement officer. The National Decertification Index was created as a means to further enhance integrity in law enforcement by preventing the interstate rehire of problem officers. There are currently more than 25,000 actions in the NDI from 44 separate states. California is one of only 5 states that does not report decertified officers to the NDI. This is probably because California Post can only decertify officers for fraud or administrative error in the application process, not for any problem behavior after the badge was pinned to an officer. So only if somebody lied on their application or they weren't technically qualified to be an officer and somebody made a mistake, can an officer be decertified. I think that this needs to change, and we should be able to decertify officers for problem behavior in uniform. It is important to note that California has made some progress with officer accountability. In 2018, Governor Brown signed Senate Bill 1421 and Assembly Bill 748, dramatically increasing public access to law enforcement officer disciplinary records. Although a step in the right direction, several police chiefs and sheriffs instructed their officers to purge their records according to department policy prior to January 1st, 2019, so to not provide the public access to disciplinary actions unnecessarily. This obviously is no longer an issue because we're after 2019, but for officers on the job prior to 2019, we did lose data. So what can we do that might make a difference? First, recognize that some things have changed for the better. We have police leaders who understand and recognize the importance of democratic policing and community support. They are using terminology such as accountability, transparency, legitimacy, procedural justice. Only a very small handful of police chiefs were using those words or knew their meaning 5 or 6 years ago. So this is a step forward. That is kind of a big deal, especially if it guides their practices in the right direction. We still have a ways to go, but I'm highly optimistic that this is a watershed moment in history that will produce significant change. It won't all be overnight, but it will come as long as we, the people, continue to insist on it. So second, we need to take a hard look at department policies as well as state and federal laws and Supreme Court cases that provide too much protection to officers and not enough accountability for the public. We've already seen many law enforcement agencies across the country adopt use of force policies proposed by the 8 Can't Wait campaign, including requiring de-escalation and a warning before shooting, as well as banning chokeholds, strangleholds, shooting at moving vehicles, and including a duty to intervene for officers who witness an officer using excessive force. This is a really good start and sign that so many police chiefs put out letters showing how their department policies were already in line with the 8 Can't Wait campaign, or they revised their policies accordingly. This is good because research tells us that more restrictive policies change officer behavior, and in this case, reduce police shootings and other uses of force. We need to include police unions as well as community members in these accountability conversations. Police unions have been instrumental in expanding the number of college-educated officers in departments as a matter of professionalization, and I think they can and should be part of the solution here. Again, new policies will need to achieve a delicate balance that must both protect officers when executing the powers of their office in good faith, while holding officers accountable for misbehavior. Third, we need to change the culture in policing. We need to start by hiring the right people, those who are service-oriented rather than adventure-oriented. We need more college-educated cops in departments where there are few, and we need to increase the diversity of many agencies across the country so that they reflect the communities that they serve. Research tells us that all of these things matter. We also need to improve training. Academies need to teach police history so that officers recognize that some people don't trust police because police haven't always been on the right side of history. A class in critical race theory could be really beneficial too. Specific stress management classes should be offered as well, and have shown some potential to reduce the level of force used during training exercises by teaching officers how to remain calm during highly stressful situations. Academies also need to train recruits in the principles of constitutional or democratic policing and procedural justice. Likewise, they need to emphasize the guardian mentality over the warrior mentality because labels matter. How an officer sees herself or himself, guardian or warrior, conflict negotiator or crime fighter, impacts how she approaches the job and interacts with her fellow officers and members of the community, both law-breaking and law-abiding. A guardian protects. That doesn't mean a guardian is soft. Quite the contrary. A true guardian will stop at nothing to protect those he or she is charged to protect. Think about parents here, both human and animal. Meanwhile, a warrior is on the offensive. They are looking for any sign of trouble to quash. If we think about the protests, we can see how some agencies took on a guardian mentality. Those are the agencies that walked alongside and marched alongside the protesters. Those are the agencies that stood aside while protesters peacefully protested. On the other hand, we've seen lots of warrior mentality agencies. Those are the ones that we see in the riot gear, pushing, clearing streets, attacking peaceful protesters. Now, we don't always see the full picture when we see clips on the media. And to be fair, there were people throwing rocks at the police and throwing bottles of urine and doing other things. And we had looters. So the protests, the peaceful protests, were hijacked in some cases by individuals with different agendas. And the police have to react and they have to protect in that situation. They are charged with protecting all of the people. But in some cases, we see them being overly aggressive. That's the warrior mentality. That's not the guardian mentality. Pushing a guardian mentality is not always a popular opinion, but I'm convinced it's the right opinion. And once people recognize that guardians can be as fierce as warriors, I hope that people come around and see the difference and the distinction between guardians and warriors. So this warrior mentality is ingrained in the traditional police subculture and ethos, which means that it may be quite difficult to shift officers who identify completely with this subculture towards a guardian or community-oriented philosophy. This suggests that in order to move away from a warrior or crime fighter mentality towards a guardian mentality or any other innovative police practice that's not aligned with the traditional police subculture, police executives may need to first change the culture within the organization. And that's not going to be an easy thing to do. And in fact, that is what some citizens in places around the country, that is why some are calling for a complete dismantling of some departments. For example, in Minneapolis, residents are so unhappy with many of their police, with their police department, due to the pervasive culture within the organization, that they're not sure that they can actually save the organization. And in fact, Camden, New Jersey found that it had to completely fire all of its officers only to rehire the ones that they wanted back, that had the right mentality and the right attitude and the right perspective that they wanted for their officers. So it'll be interesting to see how some of this ends up playing out. When you have citizens and residents calling for a complete dismantling of the police, it's because there is likely a pervasive culture issue within that department that people don't think can be fixed. But we are at a moment in time where it might be possible to fix some of these departments that are broken. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that all departments are broken, because that's clearly not the case. But some are, and we need to work to fix those. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My email is on the front slide, and thank you for listening.